Hello, I'm Allan Gregg, a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies in our Toronto office. Welcome to this, our first webinar of the fall season, where we're going to focus on the Conservative Leadership Contest that has just passed last Saturday and what this portends for politics going forward. As usually, I'm joined by my colleagues. We have Yaroslav Baran, who is a principal in our Ottawa office. More recently, he ran the communications operation for the party, and he had to organize the actual event on Saturday. New addition to the team is Laura Kurkimaki. She is a former Deputy Chief of Staff in the Office of the Leader Opposition and also a principal in our Ottawa office. Rob Leone, principal in our Toronto office, former member of Provincial Parliament representing the Kitchener-Waterloo region at Queen's Park. And last but certainly not least, Carleen Dick, principal of in our Vancouver office, longtime party activist in provincial politics in Alberta and BC, and now describes herself as a reluctant conservative. We'll get into more of that, Carleen. But first, I want to start with Laura, because we've got breaking news that Pierre Poilievre has just announced what he calls his inflation-busting leadership team. What does this, is there a pattern there? What does this tell you about how he's going to lead the Conservative Party in the future?
Thanks, Alan, and hello, everyone. Yes, just about 30 minutes ago, they just announced their leadership team. It looks like a fairly experienced team. Melissa Landsman and Tim Uppal we see as two deputy leaders, obviously reaching out to some of Canada's more diverse communities. Melissa being a member of the LGBTQ2+ community, and Tim Uppal being a strong Sikh member of the Canadian community here. Tim was also on the previous leadership team, and Melissa was just on it under Candace Bergen, so two experienced folks there. We see Andrew Scheer back as a Conservative House Leader, a role that he held under Rona Ambrose for a number of years, and as of course has a lot of experience on the parliamentary procedure side, being Speaker for 4 years under former Prime Minister Harper. We see several of his allies as well on the team, including Chris Workington, who's a deputy whip and QP coordinator and served as QP coordinator when Andrew was leader. We see the sole Quebec endorser for Pierre Paul Hoos as the Quebec lieutenant, Carrie Lynn Findlay, a longtime Conservative member and former cabinet minister, as a whip, and a couple other positions as well that signal a couple of different things. We have one Atlantic member on the leadership team, which I know had been lacking in the past. So I think our Atlantic caucus will be happy about that. Jake Stewart is now the caucus committee coordinator, which I believe is also a new position. And Eric Duncan is actually retaining his position that he held under Aaron O'Toole as caucus party liaison. So lots of continuity on the leadership team so far.
No olive branch to the Charest supporters? Evidence
doesn't look that way. Doesn't look that way.
The fact that this was announced in his Twitter account rather than at a press conference, what does that tell you, again, about the leadership style going forward?
Well, I don't think that Pierre is going to spend too much time talking to the mainstream media or the press gallery. He spent almost no time doing that during the leadership and went around them multiple times to deliver his message straight to Canadians. And that's what he's doing as well. We haven't even seen him give a press conference yet so far. So no surprise on our end that he's making this important announcement on his own social media channels.
Yeah, a little
Alan. Sorry, if I may.
I just want to ask you something specific here, because Doug Ford didn't bother with the tour bus either. I mean, is this a new Conservative tactic that we're seeing here?
I'm not sure it's particularly new. I mean, Pierre certainly didn't invent it, but we really need to underscore this point. It's a significant point that you flagged. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Poilievre went through the entire leadership campaign without doing a single kind of traditional, major interview with a journalist. It was a town hall meeting and social media campaign, and that's how he won, and that appears to be how one wins these days.
Our new slogan is thinking forward. So I want to spend most of the time anticipating what this all means for the future. But first, I have to go back, Rob. I mean, we've been watching this guy for over 20 years now. he didn't just win. I mean, he wiped the floor with a former national leader, 3-term premier, won virtually every riding in the country. This is a crushing defeat of Jean Charest and a massive victory, the likes of which arguably we really haven't seen before. What's going on here?
I think Pierre Poilievre struck a chord. You know, he's talking, as Yaroslav just mentioned, directly to Canadians. You know, he's not worried about where where the parliamentary press gallery is going to be on any given day. He's made, and this isn't a new thing, like he's been developing his social media presence for years and years and years. So those who've actually been watching him know that his strategy is to go directly to people with messages that work. During the last federal campaign, for example, some of his own social media commercials were some of the most viewed elements of the Conservative campaign. So he's not adverse to being strategic about how he plays on social media. His message is piercing, it's appealing to people. He signed up more people to join the leadership race than any other person in the history of the country. And you know, I think one point also goes pretty well with this is that in the 21st century, we've had 3 national leaders that have won on the first ballot, and each of them have become prime minister. And you know, if we're doing the look behind in terms of trying to project on a go forward basis, I think he's got a lot of momentum behind him to carry into a general election.
Those other leaders, though, were all heir apparents. I mean, 2 years ago, Jean Charest certainly didn't think this was going to happen. He had no idea of the appeal of this guy. Any of the other panelists have a point of view here too? Yarrow?
Oh yeah, sure. I've got a point of view on everything, Alan. Look, yeah, if you asked any staffer on the Hill 5 years ago, they would have told you, yeah, we saw this coming a mile away. But then you talk to the Ottawa bubble, you know, the thinking class, the chattering class, the kind of the political has-beens like myself, people who aren't actually in the thick of it, who kind of hang out in the same places and drink the same wines, and for that group, it's like, where the heck did this come from? Who is this guy? Who would have thought he should be taken so seriously?
What were they missing? What were they missing there? Because that is the prevailing view. I mean, there's people who still think, well, this guy's a peripheral kind of extremist nut job.
Yeah, but keep in mind, Alan, a lot of that same analysis pertained to Justin Trudeau before his crushing win in 2015. People were saying, this guy's not serious. He's a flake. He's a lightweight. He's just his old man's name. And then, man, did he ever run a decisive campaign? And I tell you, man, like there's a lot of similarity between those two. And that pertains to their charisma, their appeal, their way to connect with real people out there in the real world. So you watch this guy.
I want to bring Carling in here because before we knew that he raised $6 million, $6 million.
Over $6 million.
Over $6 million, 4 million more than Jean Charest. I mean, just unheard of, stunning. Before we learned that he had signed up 311,000 new party members, we knew he was drawing big crowds, really big crowds out there.
Yeah.
What do you think his appeal is to the people who came out to see him?
I think he's tapping into people's angst right now. I mean, as one of my colleagues described earlier today, Pierre is a message machine. He knows how people are feeling, and he knows how to connect with them. His messaging is spot on, and people are drawn to him because of his messaging. I mean, year or two ago, the top issues, environment, pandemic, COVID, those things have dropped off. They're not, still important to people, but the cost of living now is really what everybody's feeling, and he's talking about that. That's all he's talking about, and people are listening.
I want to get more into his messaging, especially on cost of living. But first, Laura, I mean, you've been watching him for a long time. I mean, and you claim that you saw this coming. Can you explain his appeal?
Yeah, well, for a long time, as Yaro had mentioned, folks that have been working in the party and volunteering in the party have been big fans of Pierre for a long time. Not only was he an effective communicator when we were in government, as parliamentary secretary to the prime minister, defending a lot of the government's decisions for many years, then became obviously a cabinet minister, but I think really found his groove once the Harper government lost in 2015, and he took on a very prominent role in the opposition benches. During that time, he grew his own social media platform substantially. He often undertook his own messaging, didn't toe the line of the leader's office or maybe the central campaign messaging, and really spoke directly to people. And that's one of his big appeals, is Pierre has been the same guy for many, many years, and he's always had a strong base of support in the party, but because of this work that he's been doing for many years. So a lot of folks that are active in the party right now, when he, were very disappointed in 2020 when he pulled out of the race. I think a lot of people, he had a big swell of support in the first few months that he was active in sort of exploring that opportunity. So when he announced this time, I mean, for a lot of folks here, it was obviously over before it even started.
He had a Allan, he had a great video last week. Laura spoke to sort of the simple messaging that connects with people. So he put a video out, I think it was last week. My colleagues might remember better than me, but it was breakfast with Justin Trudeau. So he's sitting in a diner, eating breakfast and speaking to the camera, speaking to Justin Trudeau. And every time he picks up a piece of his meal, the eggs, the toast, the coffee, the bacon, he talks about how the percentage that the cost has gone up. And it's really simple messaging that people can understand.
Before we continue, I don't know why I always forget this, but there is a Q&A button for those who are listening in. You should feel free to ask questions either to any individual panelist or the panel as a whole. And again, sorry for interrupting this great riff of conversation. Yaro, you wanted to jump in there and add to that?
No, I was just also going to say, we've talked about the crowds that he drew, but there's also the membership sales. Like he sold, and look,
well, talk to me about that.
Yeah.
I mean, he sold over 400,000 people voted, most of them recruited, obviously by the 68%.
Yeah,
tell us what the party looks like today.
Yeah, I was privy to some stuff that's not in the public domain, and I can't disclose everything, but I can tell you this: when the membership cutoff came, different campaigns were making claims. Oh, we sold X, we sold Y. Let's just say not every campaign really sold what it claimed to sell, and in some cases not even close. But I can tell you this: his campaign said they sold 311,000 memberships. They did indeed sell 311,000 memberships. That's great. Like, that's astounding. I've never seen that before, ever. I mean, the party membership now, I think Ian Brody, the chair of the leadership committee, when he announced the number, said, like, there are more people in the Conservative Party now than there are in the city of Hamilton. Like, that's huge. We've never seen this before, ever in Canada.
Detractors would say these are all Trump supporters and Convoy protesters.
I don't know. Did you hear the streeters at the convention? I mean, all the media were doing this. They were stopping random, people at the event, and it was, New Canadian talking about how it's too hard to start a business, and that's why I'm supporting Pierre, or 23-year-old saying, I despair about ever owning a home, that's why I joined the party. Seniors saying, I'm watching my savings evaporate in front of me, that's why I support. Like, I've never seen, frankly, as diverse a coalition as I saw on Saturday night at that event. And that diversity of coalition was also highly, highly represented in the speech that he delivered on Saturday night, which is really something.
I want to talk about the constituency that he has to go after, but first, the more immediate constituency, Rob, is caucus. 2/3 of caucus supported him. That was really impressive. But the corollary is 1/3 didn't. I mean, you've been in a Conservative caucus, albeit at Queen's Park, and they are known to be far more fractious and disruptive than most caucuses. I mean, what does he have to do with those detractors in caucus, or is this win so overwhelming that he can just ignore them?
Well, I have to say, being in a Conservative caucus, my favorite 3 hours of the parliamentary week were caucus meetings, because you never knew what you'd expect heading in there. You'd think that you were going to be talking about one thing, and they quickly get derailed and other things that would be talked about that were on people's minds. And I have to tell you, inside the caucus room, no one holds back in terms of how they feel and what they believe in. The great hope of a caucus is that after the caucus meeting, decisions are made in that the public-facing view of caucus is united, and I think that holds true now for Pierre because he's won such a commanding lead, and I think it will continue to hold true so long as he's performing well. I think where things start to fall apart and where leaders and previous conservative leaders of the federal party and in my experience the provincial party is that when things aren't going well is when folks start to deviate from messages, try to go it on their own, thinking that they have a better pulse of what their constituents ultimately feel and want to hear from their leaders. And I think that's the challenge that Pierre has. The other challenge, I would say, the heavy emphasis on freedom, the conservative bent towards having members of caucus with free votes and going out and talking about any issue that they so please. I think that may also pose as a challenge because they may feel emboldened to start talking about matters that may not be as precise and relevant as the campaign message. And so, the media does look for, the media that Pierre Poilievre doesn't want to talk to, does look for those inconsistencies between the party message and what the caucus and candidates are ultimately saying. So, that's one thing I think has to be of top of mind, is how in an environment of advocating for ultimate and maximum freedom for people, that was the first message, to make Canada the freest country in the world. How does that play when you have a caucus that actually wants to test that out? And I think that would be something to look for in the dynamic in the months ahead.
I want to bring you all in on his acceptance speech and what you read there. But first, Yaro, it was obvious that in this speech there was no mention of cryptocurrency, there was no mention of the Freedom Convoy, there was no mention of the World Economic Forum, all major applause lines during the campaign. And a lot of commentators are talking about the pivot, the conservative pivot, that you win by running right of center with the party, but then when an general election comes, you have to pivot to the center in order to broaden the base. Are we likely to see that with this guy?
Look, thing about Pierre is I think he's been, uncannily consistent throughout his career. I mean, we've all been reading, retrospective bios about, how he started off in a debate club in high school and all that kind of stuff. And the essay that he wrote 20 years ago still stands up today in terms of his messaging and that sort of thing. So he has a way of being consistent in what he says and what he believes, but being able to adjust to how he says it depending on who he's talking to. And that, to my mind, is a mark of a good politician. And, speaking of the pivot or trying to appeal to a broader circle, Saturday night was crazy. I didn't even hear the speech. I was busy trying to frantically move stanchions to create an exit corridor along the back wall so we wouldn't get mobbed by supporters. So I didn't even hear it that night. Next morning, calm, I went for a run, plugged in my earbuds, listened to the speech, totally fresh, and it struck me like, okay, what did he talk about? Hope, the struggles of single moms, millennials and home ownership, Indigenous control over Indigenous lands, seniors in retirement and in retirement savings, the plight of farmers, food security, hope. I was thinking, it struck me, Barack Obama could have delivered that exact same speech and nobody would have blinked. It would have fit. And so for all this talk about hard right, like whatever, actually listen to what the guy's saying. Like, I think that the old paradigm is gone. What he is a politician, a leader who is able to listen to the concerns of people. He's hearing the forgotten, the insulted by their own government, people with legitimate anxieties about homeownership or their finances or whatever, who are really worried. He's actually listening to them, hearing them, and he's validating their concerns. That's what he is. I mean, for everybody who tells me that he's a hard right politician, my usual response is no. Actually, you know what he is? He's a Prairie New Democrat. He takes the same approach to politics that we got from Bill Blakey, from Lord Nystrom, back in the day, from From
Well, I want to.
icons.
I'm going to get to some of the stuff that Tommy Douglas would have never talked about that he talks about a lot. But before that, I want to bring Laura in. I mean, reflections on the speech and the prospect of a Paul Revere pivot, and then Carling, and then Rob.
Yeah, Alan, I was just flagging to you because we have many questions in the chat. So I want to make sure that we get to some of those. But to just riff on what Yara was saying about the speech, what struck me and other women that I have talked to is how impressive his wife's speech actually was, and the intro that she gave. For folks that haven't been watching his rallies, I have, and she's been introducing him at almost all the rallies that she's been at. But for a lot of people, that was the first time that they were really seeing her on that stage. And we have, you know, a trilingual immigrant who, you know, grew up in Montreal, and she did a really, really good job. And we saw her highlighted again yesterday at the first caucus meeting. So I know we haven't touched too much on the whole speculation about a pivot and that kind of thing, but I think the softening of the message more so is what we're already seeing, which is the same message set, but given towards a different segment of the population in a way that's, you know, easier for them to understand.
There you go.
Carling, and then Rob, and then Laura. Well, then we'll go right to the audience questions.
Well, just one thing I really picked up on, Yarrow mentioned the word hope. I've been listening to a bunch of interviews with various conservatives since that speech, and the word that I hear over and over again is hope. And I suspect we'll hear that going forward. I think that's going to be sort of a key word for Pierre and the Conservatives going forward. So,
Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think that leadership races are about pulling constituencies and appealing to groups and selling memberships and having them turn out ultimately. And that's a style of campaigning that's a lot different than an appeal in a general election. You know, for me, it's less about you know, trying to say, hey, you're a hard conservative and this is what you believe, and you know, you have some sort of, you know, hostility to elites. You're getting further behind while they're getting further ahead. It's a general sentiment that a lot of people feel, so that message doesn't necessarily change in a general election. It's just how and who is being talked to. I think that does, and there's a lot of appeal. You know, I live in a rural community in southwestern Ontario. 4,000 or 5,000 people live in my village. And you know, people are concerned. Like, you talking to the average parent that I'm in my mid 40s, and we're all concerned about how our kids are ever going to afford a home. They can't afford a home in our community, or, you know, there's no housing supply here. Anything that goes on the market is, you know, double or triple what we bought it for 10 years ago. You know, so I think that, you know, those are real sentiments. That's what people talk about around the dinner table, around the bonfire that they're having in their backyards. You know, at the barbecues that they've been having all over the summer, and these are real concerns, and so it's not necessarily that he has to change his message. The narrative is the same, that people are getting further ahead and you're getting further behind, and that has to change, and there's someone to blame for that, right? I think, you know, that is ultimately, here's the promise and here's the hope, but part of that means that you have to actually get rid of the government that has led to a lot of the challenges that we're currently facing, so long as he can convince people that the government has been the central culprit of their angst. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of, you know, hope was a term. You know, obviously I'm a conservative through and through, and I have hope that there's going to be a vision, a comprehensive vision, a consistent vision that the party can once again put before people and have them attract people. I will say one other thing about the sort of coalition of voters that Pierre has tapped into. And when I was canvassing in my own elections, it was always peculiar to me that some of the best support I ever got were in working class neighborhoods, right? And I think that what Pierre Poilievre has understood is that those are our voters. Those people vote conservative. Despite what, you know, other people might think, these people are voting conservative, and they have been voting conservative.
Hold that thought, because I think this is a really, really important area that I want to spend some real time on. But before that, Let's go to Laura. She's been monitoring the questions from the audience. Anything there you want to put to any of the individuals or the panel as a whole, Laura?
I have been monitoring. We actually have a lot of questions.
I see that.
And one of them that I think actually maybe we can just go back to Rob, which is talking about actually a piece that I wrote in the Hill Times recently. But it's sort of the second half of the question is, how is the Conservative Party going to provide differing policy options than the government on things that Pierre hasn't spoken about yet? So the example given is, biomanufacturing, support for tech startups, health science policy, or he asks, will the opposition stick to wedge issues until the election? So maybe we'll just turn it over to Rob and then Yara.
That's an interesting question. Is he even going to bother with that kind of granular policy, or is he just going to stay right at that very, very high level?
It's funny, we just went through a provincial campaign here in Ontario where, in the one previous to that in 2018, there actually wasn't even a Conservative campaign document, and the last campaign was basically a regurgitation of what budget 22 was, right? So, how comprehensive these issues are going to be, I think will remain of interest. I will say, though, in the throngs of this conversation, is that the level of detail that Pierre takes on policy is, I think, something we haven't seen before, right? And we've all heard stories that Stephen Harper was a micromanager. He wanted to know every little detail about policy. I'm expecting the same thing from Pierre, who's very interested in understanding the nuances, the concerns, the dynamics, and the debates, and understanding how he can influence that. I mean, I got a call from the transition team yesterday on an issue that of childcare policy. So I think that there's real interest in having a comprehensive understanding of what the major issues are today, so that we can provide a response ultimately to the concerns that are out there.
Yarrow, you got the same sense that this guy is going to give a comprehensive policy?
Well, look, he's going to have to, and we usually get a taste during a leadership campaign, and then the actual policy comes out closer to an election campaign in full detail. But if the question is differentiation, how is he going to differentiate on the same issues with the Liberals? I can tell you exactly how he's going to differentiate, and we're already seeing it before our eyes. Take an issue that every party's trying to talk to, things like lack of housing. These guys over here saying, well, we're proud to announce 500 million in additional investments in the housing incubator, blah, 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 accelerator fund, blah, blah. To normal people outside the bubble, that means zero. They don't even know, that kind of a technocratic answer means nothing. But there's a whole bunch of people out there who do understand when Mr. Poilievre says, know what we're going to do? Federal government's got a whole bunch of land it's not using. Weeds are growing on it. We're going to build homes on it. And we're going to work with the municipalities, and we're going to give them these lands, and we're going to actually build houses on land we already got, right? People get that. They don't know what a housing accelerator, incubator, blah, blah, blah is. So that's how he's going to differentiate, by communicating crisply, clearly, and directly to people in a way that they understand. And we already saw that during his whole Stuart McLean series of videos, where he's got this normal guy, folksy way of talking about stuff that people get in language that they understand. So that's the differentiator.
Laura, you don't communicate in a vacuum. And the Liberals have had a pretty refined playbook on how to deal with new Conservative leaders. They basically take something they had said or something that their colleagues have said that is clearly offside with public opinion, and they try to paint them as out of touch, right-wing extremists. This guy's pretty easy to take out of context. He said a lot of stuff that we know is contrary to public opinion. There's nothing the matter with the Freedom Convoy folks, that vaccine mandates are horrible, that cryptocurrency is a bulwark against inflation. How does he defend, or at least deflect, those attacks that invariably are going to start coming at him?
Well, arguably, he's already been defending himself against those for a number of months now, and he has been doing it fairly successfully. I mean, you might remember that even in some of our own leadership debates, they got very feisty, is the polite word that I've been using. Yaro was there in person, so he saw a lot of them. But listen, he was defending his record already against his other leadership candidates, and in some one-on-one interviews that he did. And how he has been doing that is by turning everything into talking about the economy. His messages have been extremely concise. Anytime any issue that he doesn't want to talk about comes up, he is able to pivot and talk about how, we need to listen to people. People are upset with how things are going right now and what's happening with their pocketbooks. And in terms of the convoy, I mean, that's how he's pivoted a lot. He said, there is real anger out there. I hear you, which is something that the federal government and particularly the prime minister does not say, right? These people don't think that they are being heard. So he has pivoted in some of the answers that he's given so far. And listen, I'm sure his campaign team will be, coming up with a strong narrative for the next couple of months, if not longer, depending how long we go here. So I'm sure he'll be continuing to answer every question he can with an economic response.
Carly, I mean, another part of the Liberal playbook is to take anyone who is against carbon taxation and try to position them as anti-environment or climate change denier. And this has worked very effectively, especially in Canada's major metropolitan centers, for which the Conservatives won a grand total of 0 seats in the last two elections. Is the absence of a comprehensive environmental policy, does that represent an Achilles heel for Poilievre, especially in urban Canada?
Well, I think the Conservatives are going to have an environmental policy. There's going to have to be something there, and I think if they can come up with a credible environmental policy, then opposition to things like the carbon tax and that kind of thing don't matter as much. So they need a policy, but outside of that, I sort of go back to what I said earlier, which is the environment is important to people, but we've seen, at least in public polling, I would say over the last year, it has dropped down in terms of importance to people. Cost of living, as I talked about earlier, is really top of mind. Healthcare and cost of living. So it provided he sticks to his messaging box, and that they have a credible environmental policy. I think he's going to be fine.
I want to shift gears a little bit. Sorry, did someone?
Yeah, I do want to add just a little bit to that. I think Carling is correct in the sense that the Conservatives need a response, but part of the environmental response and the responsibility now rests with industry. And we're seeing industry taking their own initiatives to become more environmentally friendly. And when we're talking about trying to embrace a more economic and prosperous vision for Canada, I don't think Pierre will be remiss to point to the fact that a lot of the solutions actually can take place without any government influence whatsoever. We just have to make the encouragement and the inducements for industry to actually follow the path towards net zero and things like that are generally speaking what the public wants. And if you're not part of that movement of trying to be cleaner and trying to reduce your carbon footprint, you're going to be offside with consumers, right? So I think there's a narrative that speaks to the fact that government doesn't always have to have the answers to every problem that's out there, which is a conservative position, but they do have a responsibility in encouraging and setting the tone and vision of what that looks like. And I think there has to be a message in there for what a future conservative policy on the environment might look like.
Well, and they just really quickly, Allan, they need to make it easier for industry to actually get things done, right? So not just the inducements, but I would say industry wants to do good, but there's so many loopholes there's so many things that they have to jump through to get things done. Government needs to make it easier for them to do these things.
I want to shift gear and talk about strategy and who these messages are aimed at. We started going down that road a little bit. But Yaro, I mean, you constantly hear Poilievre talk about hardworking Canadians. When he raises his favorite topic, inflation and the cost of living, he's not talking about monetary policy. He's talking, as you kind of noted, he's talking about the single mother who has to put water in her milk, or the 35-year-old who has to live with his parents and can't bring a date home.
Or the worker who needs new work boots but can't afford them, so he's putting tape on the hole.
Clearly, as Rob noted, this is a message aimed at the working class. I mean, I worked for the Progressive Conservatives for decades and decades, and we just said that's a lost cause.
Totally.
Doug Ford did exactly the same thing. I mean, of the 7 seats he won, I think 5 were New Democratic seats. He had 8 unions endorse him in that last producer frame. What's going on here?
Well, look, there's been a slow motion shift that's been happening over about the last at least 20 years, and few people have noticed it along the way. But the fact is, and look, Allan, you've been in and around politics for a long time, like basically since everything's so black and white, right? You've seen this up close. If you went back to 100 years ago, even way more recently, the profile of the Tory voter was elderly, wealthy, white, Protestant, golf club memberships, country club memberships, yacht club memberships, Anglo, etc. Right? Today, it could not be more diametrically opposed to that. The coalition, again, which was represented in the speech he gave, is immigrants who are frustrated trying to get ahead, single moms, working class Canadians, students, young millennials who want to own a home. Like it is such a completely different demographic, and it's a coalition that all parties believe is their own. All parties are trying to speak to. So it's really going to come down to a contest of who is speaking to those groups most effectively. And
anecdotally, anecdotally, just looking at some of those meetings, Laura, that there's lots of young people there. And as Yaro points out, a lot of references to young people. Justin Trudeau won in 2015 because there's evidence that 3 million young people who never voted before. Yeah. Is this a key constituency that the new Conservatives are aiming at?
Yeah, absolutely. And we saw that on Saturday night. We saw that in the membership sales during the course of this leadership race. We're hearing that in the streeters that we're getting courtesy of all our hardworking friends in the press gallery who are trying to get a snapshot on who these new Conservative members are. We're hearing it again and again.
I was asking.
I was never really into politics, but man, I just finished university and I don't know what to do next. I'm going to live with my mom forever, kind of thing. And that's why I like Pierre, and that's why I joined the party. We're definitely hearing a lot of that.
Laura, any expansion on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think they're also, the younger folks are people that, used to vote for the NDP, and they've been bleeding support from them for years now, since before Jagmeet Singh was there. And also folks that, as you mentioned, came out in droves for Justin Trudeau in 2015. The problem is the NDP and the Liberals have not been speaking to these people for a number of years, and Pierre is speaking directly to them. All of his messages and all of the issues that are coming up that people think is only for families that are experiencing these exact same issues are also being experienced by people who are 20 and 21 who can't get jobs in their fields, who went to university for 4 years and are still working at fast food chains and other places. The struggles that I think traditionally political parties used to only speak to, an over 35 demographic with 2 kids living in suburbia. Those same struggles are, being felt by the younger generation as well. And Pierre is speaking directly to their angst. And, there was a good article I saw somewhere this weekend talking about how, some of the MPs and senators that actually ended up, endorsing Pierre were encouraged to do so by their own children, who, went to their parents and said, I hope you're supporting Pierre. These are people that have been following Pierre, as I mentioned earlier, on social media for years, and his message to them has always been the same.
Yeah, there's something there.
Rob, Laura almost went there. Is he going after NDP voters?
Yes.
Rob? Rob, you still there?
Can I
just fall
yeah,
asleep there for a
yeah.
while?
So sorry that you're begging me to come on, and I wasn't really prompt on my response there. But here's the, we work with a lot of unions at Earnscliffe, and when Doug Ford won his first election, I'm just going to tell you an anecdotal story on why I think this is the case. And there's a question in the box about unions as well. So I'm going to try and kill a couple birds with one stone here. But so the story goes like this. Rob, can you help us talk to the Doug Ford government? And how are we going to start our conversation? We've not talked to conservatives before. That's what unions told us. Like we haven't before. We're not used to it. And I was like, okay, well, you realize who voted for you as a union leader? It's like, well, my union members did. I was like, well, who do you think voted for Doug Ford? Your union members. And in the midst of that conversation, the union leader said, funny you say that. I know my union steward in North Bay was on Vic Fideli's campaign team, it came to the realization that they're actually talking to the same people, right? And so there has to be a way of understanding that dynamic that look, working class people are actually fed up too. They feel that they're working harder and harder and they're getting behind, not ahead. And that's a real concern. And that's not one that, that is specific to an ideological paradigm. That's a class issue, that they feel that they're working harder and they're getting further behind. They're putting more money in their gas tank to get to work. They're seeing, they're diluting their meals so that they can feed their children. They're struggling for the cost of increased cost of housing, and these are primary, concerns for people. If we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like these are first order concerns, and the response that the government, the current government and their NDP coalition members are advocating are even bigger government programs.
Alan,
just a second, hold on. Go on, Carly.
Just really quickly, I was going to say, I don't think that quite yes, he's going after NDP voters. He's going after all voters. As Rob said, it's not ideological. It's tapping into this angst that people are feeling, and those people have voted for all parties in the past. He's going after everyone.
He's not talking to the lawyers and the bankers on Bay Street where I am right now. But I just wanted to make my own observation there, is that if he is going after working class voters, NDP voters, this portends the prospect of a whole different dynamic in Canadian politics. I mean, when I was active in campaigns, single biggest voting bloc was liberal conservative switchers. They do not exist anymore. They do not exist. Conversely, today, the liberal and the New Democratic vote is so porous, it's unbelievable. There's not a New Democrat who wouldn't vote liberal. There's not a liberal who wouldn't vote Democrat. If he is successful at attracting blue collar workers, that's all going to be thrown completely in the air, and we will be, trust me, befuddled for a while. Laura, again, you've been monitoring questions there. You want to pose any to the individual of the panel?
I have. We do have one from one of our clients, and I don't know how people feel about sort of the what if world, the what ifism. But he makes a good point, which is, politics in a lot of ways is timing and circumstance. So right now, things that Pierre has been talking about for a long time are front of mind. So, he's been talking about inflation, which seemed to be high, and all those sorts of things. So his what if-ism is, what if inflation is back down, the housing market corrects, the liberals kind of get it together, and sort of this anger that we see right now and angst doesn't happen or is gone at the time of the next election. So maybe I'll just send that over to Yaro for some of his thoughts.
Sure. Look, I think the simple answer to that is, again, I always coach my, my media training clients not to answer hypothetical questions, but like if that does happen, then it's going to be the next issue, because Pierre has got this uncanny ability of identifying what the top priority issue is, like 2 years ahead of everybody else, and talking about it when everybody's like, what's with Buddy over here? And then flash forward 18 months, everybody's frantically trying to catch up while he's well ahead of the game. So even if inflation is solved, he will know already he's got this instinct for it, for what top of mind people's concerns are. He'll find the next issue and he'll be all over it.
We seem to have lost Carling, but let me ask you a supplementary to that, because it bears directly on election timing. I mean, right now we have an NDP Liberal supply and confidence agreement there that in theory is good for the next 3 years. 3 years is a long time in politics. If Paul Hébert is going after NDP voters, blue collar voters, as well as other constituencies, and there's any evidence of success, the last people who are going to want an election are going to be the NDP. How do you foresee the House over the next 3 years? Yeah.
Well, I would guess that there's a greater likelihood of this. I mean, I don't want to be offensive or edgy in mislabeling it a coalition. Technically it's a supply and confidence agreement, but shorthand coalition. I think there's a better chance now that it's going to last right through till the end of this term, because I'm not sure that the Liberals are going to want an election anytime soon. I'm not sure the NDP are going to want an election anytime soon. They're both watching, in slightly different ways, but they're both watching Pierre Poilievre start to eat their lunch. I mean, on the Liberal side of it, for example, 2 months ago, if you raised inflation, the stock response was, what are you guys economic rubes? We all know that inflation is a global phenomenon. It's not, Canada's a price taker. We've just got to ride it out. There's nothing we can do about it here at home. You get, go back to, economic school, right? What's the answer? The morning after a Pierre Poilievre victory, suddenly the headlines are government pledges to table plan to eradicate inflation. It's like they're already realizing that our old answers ain't cutting it anymore, and that guy's resonating with people. And the same thing's happening with the NDP. I would personally posit that sort of traditionally the NDP is comprised roughly of three. It's a coalition of three major groupings: the environmentalists, labor, organized labor, and unionized workers, and the sort of urban, educated, downtown, ride a bicycle, don't want a car, happy to live in a condo, $14 cappuccino kind of, urban class. And increasingly in most jurisdictions, from what I see, that out of those three factions, the traditional, labor faction has been the most neglected by the NDP, and that suggests that it's ripe for a picking. And based on the messaging that I'm hearing from Pierre, he is really connecting with those kinds of voters.
Carling, I mean, he has always been effective in the House of Commons, especially at question period. Very, very good debater, questioner. Now that he's leader of the opposition, I mean, how does that stand to change the dynamic in Parliament in the next year or two?
Oh, well, I'm looking forward to it. I think he's going to play obviously a more prominent role. I think Justin Trudeau is looking forward to taking Pierre on in the House of Commons. I think he's going to carry on with his messaging that he's been using up until now. And he's going to try and speak to more Canadians. I heard a statistic this morning or yesterday that something like 50% of Canadians don't really know who he is yet, right? So now, I mean, the Conservatives know who he is, but now is his time to speak to a wider audience. And I think that starts in the House of Commons and it carries on into the public.
Laura, when you were in the OLO, I mean, traditionally, question period has been a hugely important platform for the leader of the opposition. Is it going to be for him?
Yes, I think it will be for him because, as we've already discussed, he won't spend a lot of time, if any, talking to the press gallery. And question period is always an easy way to get a clean hit on your message of the day or your message that you'd like to get across. So I think, it's really important for obviously any leader to get out there and be meeting Canadians face to face, but I think he will continue to be a pit bull for the party in the question period.
Any other questions there that you're monitoring that you want to put forward?
I have one that I think would be good for us to answer. Just we might have a couple of healthcare clients on the line, but we do have one who is asking if we know if Pierre has talked about and taken a position on what he would do with the broken healthcare system, and mentioned obviously it's sort of in some shambles right now. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, but I just wanted to mention one thing from the campaign. Obviously, Charest had a fairly substantial healthcare policy, and Pierre was asked about it during the race and said that he believes that Canada currently has the right mix of public and private healthcare delivery. But maybe I'll just turn it over to Rob and see if he has any thoughts on that.
You know, I was actually going to mention this this point, so I'm glad there was a question from our audience about this. But in relation to a previous conversation that we were having in terms of what if everything corrects? What if there's inflation, we fix the inflation crisis and the housing prices come down? You know, likely those two scenarios might occur during the middle of a recession, so I'm not sure the government's any better. But the problem is that there are prevailing crises all over the place. Healthcare being a leading part of that, and part of the problem in healthcare, which is a crisis right across the economy, is the crisis of workers. We don't have enough of them, and every industry is facing the same concerns. And so, you know, I would expect that if we're going to start fixing some of the prevailing problems in healthcare, you know, labor force strategy is probably the best place to start in terms of how do we break down the red tape, how do we break down the gatekeepers of our healthcare system in terms of trying to not allow foreign credentialed you know, doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals to actually work here. You know, that I think is where this, you know, some solutions, some creative thinking has to be, and you know, there's no better person positioned right now to tackle that problem than Pierre Poilievre.
But Yarrow, I mean, you talked earlier about how laser focused he's been on the economy. I mean, Rob offers a very interesting tactic on how to deal with a social issue, healthcare, by turning it into a labor force issue. Is he likely to venture into the so-called softer issues, or is he going to stick directly on the inflation message?
Like I mean, everything's a two-sided coin. Every social issue is economic on the flip side of it. As the Liberals, they've been consistently positioning childcare, for example, as an economic issue. You know, not just a
labor force issue as well.
And that's true across the board. Because if you look at the issues he's been talking about, they come off as social issues, or they come off as having a social issue kind of traditionally audience. You know, the single mom, the farmers having a hard time or whatever, but the underlying message throughout is economic. And if you listen to his videos and his explainers, it's he's got this phenomenal gift of finding a way to explain the complex, and that sort of transcends the old dichotomy of this is a social issue versus that's an economic issue. And you know, another example, you know, one great example, since Rob mentioned labor force, a great example of his fresh, crisp way of communicating things is, you know, on foreign credential recognition. You know, this is a bugbear for, you know, decades now. We've had this persistent issue of immigrants coming to Canada and then not being able to apply their trade because their credentials aren't recognized. You know, doctors, nurses, you know, lawyers, you know, et cetera, plumbers, whatever. So what's the traditional response? How many governments have pledged, we will establish a new secretariat to evaluate? You know, there's always sort of a machinery, a process answer, again, technocratic, that other people, that normal folks can't relate to. What's Mr. Poilievre saying about it? He's saying, here's my pledge. Once we get this thing set up, every new Canadian is going to come here within 60 days. They're going to get a green light, or they're going to get a list of how they need to upgrade their credentials. But they're going to have certainty within 60 days. That's my promise to you. Like, again, it's different, it's fresh, but addressing an age-old issue that traditionally has been communicated through, you know, technocratic process solutions.
We've only got about 5 more minutes. I have a very specific question for Rob, and then I want to go around the horn and we'll wrap it up. But Robin, one of the files you've been following very closely is the public inquiry into the use of the Emergency Act, and they're due to report fairly soon.
Yeah, the report has to be in the hands of Parliament inside a year. The act being invoked.
So how's that likely to affect the Poilievre-Trudeau dynamic?
Yeah, so the hearings are actually going to start within days, if not weeks. They're going to last for about 6 to 8 weeks. They're going to conclude mid-November, and then they'll have a report. They'll translate the report. It'll be issued in the new year. And I think that one of the things that has come out of the parliamentary committees that have been ongoing on this is, why did the government have to invoke the act to begin with, right? And so if the government's going to have difficulty answering that question, which they've shown a difficulty to date in answering that question, I think it goes to show that the response to a public health disaster was government overreach, and not necessarily based on what could have been possible, within the current confines of the law. So I think that also bolsters, hey, this is a government that when they have a problem, they have to throw more money at it. They institute a new commissioner, new council, or they have a huge state response to a problem that need not be addressed in that manner. And I think there's a runway for Poilievre to, if the cards fall in that direction, to help him with address some of the concerns that the convoyers are actually having. So it'll be dynamic to see, and that's a very short-term thing that we'll see in the next few weeks.
Oh, we're watching that. Last question to each of you, starting with Carling. I mean, for good or evil, is the election of Pierre Poilievre a game changer for Canadian politics? And if it is, why? And if it is that good or evil?
I think it is, and I think it's good. I'm always trying to encourage more people to be interested in politics and in government. And Pierre has managed to get a lot of people interested. And my hope is that he, over the course of the few years, gets more people interested in government and in politics. So I'd say
you don't worry about more division, more polarization, more alienation.
I think that as my colleagues have sort of talked about, I think there is going to be a softening of the message, and that he is going to be talking about the same thing, but adjusting his messaging to talk to a wider audience. And so I think actually we'll see less division going forward.
Laura?
Yeah, agree with what Carling said. I mean, it's always nice to see, huge swaths of people that have never voted before. I mean, Pierre's own campaign has said there's the people at their rallies had never been to a rally before. Most of them hadn't voted. Most of them haven't been engaged. So I think on the engagement side, that's really, really interesting. And polarization is already here. So I don't think this is making anything more polarized. I think people, we're always a couple of years behind our American friends. And I think that, Pierre is just speaking to what people feel right now. And people need their government to act in their best interest. And I think that, we've been missing a bit of that in recent terms. And, COVID did change the landscape a lot and how people feel about their elected officials. And you know what? We're in Ottawa. Things say Ottawa is boring, and, we're shaking things up. So we'll see how the next few months go.
Yaroslav, game changer?
Yeah, 100% game changer. He's a much crisper communicator than his predecessors, probably all of them, including Mr. Harper. There's going to be a very different chemistry now in that collegium of party leaders facing off in Parliament and elsewhere. Very different chemistry. There's certainly a new energy about the party now. And frankly, if I were a Liberal or a New Democrat, I would not be taking this lightly.
There's no chance of that happening. We know that. So last word to you, Rob.
Hey, no, but Mr. Harper always called me the token pinko in his
Rob, last word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Prime Minister in the last election said this was the most consequential election in our lifetime, and Canadians kind of went, meh. I think he's going to say the same thing next time. That it's the most consequential election in a generation. And I think, we're going to have a debate. Ultimately, we're going to have two competing visions of Canada. and voters will ultimately decide. And I actually think that's healthy and good.
Thank all of you for joining me. As always, good conversation. And those who tuned in, thank you so much. We'll be uploading this conversation to our website. We'll also be sending those who attended a link so that they can rewatch this in their at their pleasure. Those of you who posed a question and we didn't get time to answer it, we will write you back directly. But in the meantime, take care all and be safe and be well. Thank you.